through the acceptance of repentance, wherever it might be, is different from a certain type of mainstream Christian understanding of that not being enough, but God himself has to suffer on behalf of humanity, so that original sin, rather than just actual sins, is finally put to rest. That's a significant difference. But I mentioned Ishmael. Ishmael is where the two stories diverge, and where I think we actually have to begin our conversation about what significantly separates us, and where we might find some possible creative compatibility. You all know the story in Genesis, and Genesis is full of great stories that have triggered oceans of reflection and poetry and great novels. One of the greatest stories is Abraham's wife, Sarah. She's getting on, she's in her 80s. She's sure that she's never going to give Abraham the promised heir, and the heir to the promise. And so Abraham, in perhaps history's first recorded case of surrogate motherhood, with Sarah's agreement, brings in an Egyptian slave girl, Hagar, who promptly gives birth to a son. And then, in one of those amazing twists of the book of Genesis, Sarah becomes pregnant, and she has a son. So the first son, Hagar's son, is Ishmael, and the second son, Sarah's son, is Isaac. And that, in terms of at least how the medievals, and a lot of religionists today like to see the big, what academics would call the meta-history, the big history of the relationship between the different branches of Abraham's family. That's where it begins. Ishmael becomes the ancestor of Islam, because his prophetic descendant is Sayyidina Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the prophet of 7th century Makkah. Isaac becomes the ancestor of what becomes Judaism and what becomes Christianity. So that seems to be the kind of scriptural point in the book of Genesis, seems to be anticipating this. And it's important for Muslims as well, because the great culminating event in the Muslim life is always the Hajj pilgrimage. It's taking place right now. What's it about? Well, it's about many things. At the highest level, it's about reenacting our pledge of obedience and ubudiyya, slavehood to God. It's also, in terms of connectedness to history, about Abraham, and specifically about Abraham and Ishmael, because it's the sanctuary of Ishmael. According to most of the Muslim historians, Ishmael is actually buried in Mecca next to the Kaaba, along with Hajar, his mother. The Muslim story is that where Genesis has Sarah's jealousy driving out the slave girl, the surrogate mother, with her baby into the desert to, presumably, the readers would have thought, certain death, that doesn't just peter out in the desert, because the first son of a great patriarch and the signs that were given, and his name, Ishmael, which means the one who hears God, or the one whom God hears, must make him significant. The story doesn't just end there as a kind of interesting beginning that doesn't go anywhere. A promising beginning. It ends, for us, with a new beginning, which is the city of Mecca. And that's where it's unfamiliar to the West, because Mecca and Ishmael, they have no place in the Western imagination. And the Western sense of our history evolves to produce George W. Bush. Where is Mecca on that map? It's the symbol of the other, the symbol of the dark man, the symbol of the wild, rejected Ishmaelite. It's the black house, whereas we are in the White House. It's the polar opposite. But what does it mean to Muslims? Let's just hear the Muslim voice for a while. Ishmael is with his mother Hajar. They are rejected, and they go to this valley, part of the south of Canaan. Ishmael is thirsty, and there's a great painting. In fact, there are lots of great paintings of the scene, but the best known is by a French painter called Corot, which is Hajar in the wilderness. And she is there, and she is thirsty herself. And the child is at a distance, and she can't bear seeing the child suffering and the child dying. It's a moment of tremendous bathos, and apparently it's the end. But it's not the end, because the well of Zamzam appears. And from that symbol of suddenly new life, a wellspring in the desert, begins a new wellspring of a civilization that's going to be lived for God. That's important for the Muslim imagination. because our sense of what the story of Ishmael is precisely that God is with the outcast. That's what the Hajj means. It means in that incredibly remote, empty place, that valley where there was nothing, no cultivation, Bayri Zara, nobody there at all, the place where apparently the story of the teenage mother and her kid has to come to an end, that now, through the extraordinary vindication of God's promise and God's compassion to those lost people, who could be more vulnerable than them, all alone, 3 million people are now there. From every conceivable corner of the globe, and they're all saying, Labbaik Allahumma Labbaik. Here I am, Lord, at your service, here I am. That's, to my mind, that's what makes the book of Genesis, at least in these verses, make sense. That's the God who vindicates the rejected single mother. That's the God who vindicates the refugee and the outcast. His name is always Ishmael, Sayyidina Ismail, alayhi salam, the one whom God heard. Those who are heirs to what takes itself to be a privileged covenant look down upon him. He's the wild man, the dry root, the symbol of the other, and ultimately the symbol of the West's other. But in God's eyes, he is where the promise is stored that eventually will come to fruition. And who hears about Ishmael for hundreds of years, for thousands of years? But in the 7th century, in that little valley, next to Abraham's little temple, something begins with the word Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, that immediately goes out and brings light to the whole world. A more rapid and utter transformation, cultural, religious, political, economic, anything, everything, than anything else that human history has ever seen. Overnight, the Middle East is no longer the Byzantine Empire with the churches and the emperor. It becomes the Islamic world, and is to this day. An incredible energy was unleashed from ultimately the one who was thought to be the one who was most rejected. Who is the most rejected in that story then? Hajar. She's not even properly Jewish. She's from Egypt, which is the symbol of the other, the Gentile other. And that for us means that our relationship as Muslims to the West is going to have this complex dimension that goes right back to this meta-history. The West, or we should say a particular type of traditional Western literal reading of those stories, will say they are always the rejected ones. Ishmael is always the one who is outcast. One of the most popular novels in the United States recently is called Blood Moon by Hal Lindsey. Hal Lindsey is a hardline evangelical American preacher whose book, The Late Great Planet Earth, is America's all-time bestseller after the Bible. He's a significant figure. And Blood Moon is about his vision of the end times. And the end times are all about Jesus Christ returning again to Jerusalem, and the Israelis all convert and become evangelical Christians. So it looks like a happy ending, but then suddenly the Palestinians come. The evil Arabs appear, and they're led by somebody who's called Ishmael Muhammad. The very representation of what a particular type, I'm not saying all of them, a particular type of overheated American evangelical literal reading of the book of Revelation regards as being the other, the exact opposite of ourselves. And then the story ends, I suppose most of its readers, happily, when Jesus looks at them and death rays come from his eyes and burn the brains of all of the Palestinians, and everybody lives happily ever after. That's a certain type of Western rejection of anything that comes from Ishmael, that comes from the other, that comes from those who are not chosen. Most Christians reject that. Talk to them and they say, well, that's some kind of crazy American, who knows. You can't even get that book in this country. I had to order it from a dealer in America. Bestseller there. Here, Christians, everybody think, God. But in the Islamic world, there is no similar rejection of the covenant through Isaac. It's simply not there. Why? Because the Quran speaks of Ishaq and speaks of the descendants of Isaac as being also Anbiya'ullah, God's prophets, no less than Ishmael. Recently, Abraham got his face on the